So let's put the new missile arm Primaris through their paces and see what the Primaris Desolation squad can do. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a full rules review for the new Primaris Desolation squad. They're the Space Marines with the slightly over-exuberant missile launchers that are recently coming out in this Strike Force Agastus box set. They will be released individually after this. In the video we'll talk over their full rules from their datasheet in the box set, how much damage they get with their missile launchers, both indirect fire and direct fire, some obvious buffs and synergies that you might want to use in your Space Marine armies, and roughly how I think about using them in-game. These are the models that you get in the box. 2 sets of these 5 miniatures in Strike Force Agastus. I strongly suspect you'll only get 5 in a box when they're sold individually though. They're basically Games Workshop's version of Primaris Devastators, missile launcher armed Space Marines that are aimed for long-range fire support. They perhaps have had a fairly stormy reception in terms of models though. Obviously nothing's unanimous in the world of aesthetics, but a lot of people just aren't really the biggest fan of a Gatling rocket launcher with really quite big, slightly awkward missile tubes mounted on top of it. I've seen a few people thinking that these guys probably should have been Gravis or had the 2 missile launchers separated out so one was shoulder mounted. At least they'll be carrying around guns that can make the orcs jealous though. For their rules on the inbox datasheets, we get a heavy support slot for Codex Space Marines. These guys are indeed 35 points per model. The only upgrade that costs any points is the Vengor launcher, which costs plus 10. You can take between 5 and 10 miniatures in the squad. They basically have the same sort of stat line that you'd expect of a standard intercessor. They move 6 inches, hit on 3s, have 2 wounds and 2 attacks. The sergeant gets leadership 8 and 3 attacks as per normal. There's nothing particularly funky going on with these, like innate ballistic skill 2+ or anything like that. Then for the weapon systems, every model gets that Castellan launcher, the underslung Gatling rocket. This one's one that fires out of line of sight, 36 inches, D3 shots at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1. It ignores line of sight and has the blast keyword as well, so quite good against squads that are 6 or more. It's never really going to be the main event on a 35-point model, but you certainly could chip away with light infantry with those, and you don't have to fire it at the same target as the rest of the main guns. Then for the other weapons, the majority of the squad are armed with either Super Crack or Super Frag rockets. Unlike with missile launchers, you don't get to pick each of these each turn, you have to commit them pre-game. The Super Frag ones are the ones with the 4 barrels, and the Super Crack ones are the ones with 2 barrels, so you're basically dedicating your squads to either anti-infantry or anti-armour. The Super Crack ones definitely pack a punch. 1 shot at 48-inch range, strength 8, AP 3, and a big damage D3+3. That's some pretty powerful stuff there. The Super Frag ones, on the other hand, are D3+3 shots, strength 4, AP -1, damage 1, and blast, so an average of 5 shots there, and will be very good at shredding toughness 3 infantry in particular. Out of the two, I feel like the Super Crack is better overall. We'll do a quick damage comparison in a second. Finally, the sergeant can elect to take either of those choices, but instead can swap things out for a Vengor launcher if you prefer that. This one is a barrage option that costs 10 points more than the Super Frag or the Super Crack. It fires with ignores line of sight at 48 inches, heavy D6, strength 6, AP -1, and damage 2 with the blast keyword. As barrage weapons go in 40k, getting this on a model that basically costs 45 points really isn't too bad at all. It's not too much firepower off a whole Space Marine whirlwind, though I will admit they're not exactly paragons of damage output in themselves. If you do buy in the Vengor launcher as well though, then he comes with a targeting optics upgrade. This gives himself a +1 to hit when he's firing any heavy weapons, so it will affect both the Vengor launcher and the Castellan launcher. So even when he's taking the barrage penalty and worsening his ballistic skill, he'll still be hitting on 3s at this at base, and he might be hitting on 2s if he uses a Signum upgrade on himself. He gets to hand out ballistic skill 2+ to one model in the unit of your choice, which I think would often be the sergeant if you're firing that Vengor launcher around. It does mean that this Desolation squad sergeant really is quite potent in terms of ignores line of sight firepower. You could have him just chugging away with a ballistic skill 2+ Vengor and Castellan launcher, even when he's ignoring line of sight. I suppose if you're trying to take down big tanks or something, it might well be better worth just throwing the Signum on one of the Super Crack missile launchers in the unit. That might get you more results. Overall, they're basically going to be fairly static Space Marine heavy support, a bit of barrage fire and a bit of direct fire, an interesting kind of unit that's maybe not got all that great defensive stats, but between the 2 firing modes does hit pretty hard. In terms of damage output, here's just a quick comparison for Super Frag missiles versus Super Crack missiles. For these numbers, they aren't in Devastator Doctrine, and we're not using the Signum on any of them, but lining them up against a whole bunch of lightly targets, the Super Frag missiles outperform quite significantly against light infantry, You'd expect them to kill around about 7 or 8 guardsmen for 4 of them, but then the super crack missiles outperform against anything with 2 wounds or better basically. They kill around 2 space marines rather than 1.7, 1 or 2 dead terminators as opposed to less than 1, around about 7 or 8 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or around 3.5 to toughness 8 vehicles with a -1 damage and 5+ invul. Particularly against the harder targets, they are so much better than the super frag. Out of these two, I would certainly take the super crack missiles. I think it just adds a lot more value. Space Marines often have all sorts of heavy stubbers and things that are quite good at clearing screens. Plus, the unit itself has a lot of Castellan launchers that you could direct to anti-infantry duties in direct fire if you needed to. I feel like it makes them a lot more rounded to actually be able to threaten big tanks fairly significantly. In terms of barrage damage output though, here's roughly what you can expect out of the Castellan launchers and that Vengor launcher. This is assuming that we have taken the Vengor launcher for the extra 10 points. The Sergeant uses the Signum on himself, so he'll still be hitting on a 2+ despite the barrage penalty, which makes your ballistic skill worse and the enemy saves better. And we will fire it with a Devastator Doctrine in play, say the first turn of a game for many chapters, but some chapters just like to sit in Devastator all game long, like say Iron Hands or perhaps Dark Angels. The missiles are really quite slanted to killing light infantry. You could expect to kill around about 6 or 7 guardsmen with this, assuming the squad's 10 models and the Castellan launchers get their blast rule. The numbers maybe aren't quite so impressive for standard Space Marines. You'd expect 1 or 2 standard Marines, around 2 wounds shaved off Terminators, and things get a lot worse if the Vengor launcher is wounding on 5s, is less than 2 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle on average. Overall, this firepower is really quite strong against light infantry though, and it can chip away a bit against heavier targets if you just need to kill one last Space Marine on an objective or something. Certainly in some matchups, this amount of indirect fire is going to be really quite meaningful, particularly armies like Genestealer Cult and Eldar who've got fragile units that want to hide behind terrain, and maybe the same with Imperial Guard like Mortars and Kazakin. In terms of getting more out of the squad, for the most part, I'd expect them to be at least somewhat independent. I guess if you are using a fire-based unit or two, it wouldn't be too hard to nose them into a reroll aura for a Primaris Captain or Lieutenant or something. If you really wanted to go the whole hog with the barrage weapons, I suppose you could throw full Chapter Master rerolls on them, but I feel like that's often going to have better targets for direct fire. I'd say rerolls are kind of helpful if you can get them, but maybe not going to be worth it enough to justify you buying entire characters to support them. You could also do other things in theory, like a +1 to hit from a Chaplain, or a 5+ invul save from a Librarian, but they seem kind of better targeted elsewhere. Stratagems wise, I think the most efficient one is probably going to be Transhuman Physiology if they do happen to get targeted by something. Maybe something moves very fast around to get line of sight, or they get hit by ignores line of sight firepower that the enemy has. They're pretty valuable models, and if the enemy is wounding them on 3s or 2s, 1 CP could be worth it. Otherwise, things like intercepting from Auspex scan, adaptive strategy to put them back in Devastator Doctrine, or uncompromising fire to do actions while you still shoot, or could be okay. All those are pretty pricey though at 2 CP each. In terms of standout chapters for these guys, as with just about everything else that's a heavy weapon on an infantry platform or even a vehicle, Iron Hands are well worth talking about. With their all-game Devastator Doctrine, they can move and shoot without taking the heavy weapon penalty, plus they also just casually get to reroll 1s to hit all game long, as well as get the extra AP. Seems like really quite a good fit for this unit, as it is with plenty of others really. I guess it could particularly help them if they were hiding behind terrain and then they wanted to move forward to put down their direct fire missile launchers on a key target. They'd be able to move and shoot, still hit on 3s, and even reroll 1s as well. Iron Hands can also give them some decent damage boost stratagems and feel no pain type save either from their core chapter tactic or one of their other stratagems. Otherwise, I think Dark Angels are perhaps particularly worth mentioning. Their chapter tactic gives them a +1 to hit if they're stationary. It's going to be particularly helpful for barrage units. You could have that counteracting the -1 to hit on the Castellan launchers and just make these guys even more efficient targeters of light infantry. You could even use the Signum from the Sergeant on a different model, as they're already getting the +1 to hit from the chapter tactic. With Raven Wing being very much in vogue at the moment, Dark Angels can happily spend all game in Devastator Doctrine, another big win for these guys. Finally, in terms of chapters that really like sitting in Devastator Doctrine, Imperial Fists I think are worth a mention as well. They get to ignore light cover as well, which is pretty handy for these low AP barrage weapons that want to target infantry. Plus they could get some good rerolls with the Eye of Hypnoth, and they do like their Devastator Doctrine as well, which could give them extra damage against vehicles with the super cracks. I feel like most chapters could at least have some synergy with them. Raven Guard could get cover at range, Ultramarines get a bit more mobility and tactical doctrine, plus plenty of buff characters. Salamanders have inbuilt rerolls and some damage stratagems, and Templars could get them some 5+ invul saves. I feel like they probably most stand out for the first 3 chapters though. They're going to be so much better in a chapter that wants to sit in Devastator Doctrine all game long, and all of these can offer them a different boost to their firepower on top of that. So if I were to take some of these in my army in-game, I think the weapons I'd choose would be the Super Crack missiles plus the Vengor launcher on the Sergeant. Squads of 5 seem better for more Signums and Sergeants with the Vengor launchers, and I'd probably not buy in any specific characters to support them, but if you had a Captain or Lieutenant, then probably start with them on the first turn before they move up and get out of range. I'd probably not go too crazy on them in terms of squads in the army. I don't think you'd be wanting an entire battle line of these guys, maybe just 1 or 2 units that pay a bit of a premium for their barrage fire. For deployment, they'll likely want to be behind a line of sight blocking ruin in your own deployment zone, perhaps on an objective if they can be. If they can hold down a point while also contributing to the game with a bunch of firepower, then that's usually going to be a good thing. I'd say this is definitely a unit that you don't want the enemy to be shooting at first. 35 points for the 2 wound defensive profile is very underwhelming indeed. It's not going to take too much firepower efforts to clear the squad, so ideally you want them to deal damage before the enemy does it to you. With that in mind, if the enemy army doesn't have that many good guns that could actually affect these guys, then you could just get them in line of sight and using their direct fire missiles right from the start. Might be pretty good against armies that are very combat heavy, perhaps say Chaos Demons or World Eaters or something. Get those crack missile launchers into the right targets right from the get-go, while they also fire at other things with the barrage fire. If they're not going to be safe though, and particularly if there's enemy targets that are going to be really good to shoot at with those Castellan missiles or the Vengor launcher, maybe armies like Eldar, Genestealer Cult or Guard, then probably stay hidden for at least a turn or 2 and inflict barrage fire, ideally trying to take down fancy elite infantry like Aspect Warriors or pricey jet bikes that mainly get value by being fast and remaining hidden. I feel like against most foes that don't have just amazing optimal targets like that, you're probably going to need to do a round or 2 of barrage fire, and then at some point commit to the direct fire, move out of terrain, maybe take the heavy weapon penalty if you need to, and actually lay down those super crack missiles and blow up something important. In terms of target selection, I'd want to be going after things like toughness 7 vehicles with the super cracks. Things with -1 damage are quite a good target for them in particular. And the Castellans and the Vengor launcher ideally want to be going after toughness 3 or 4 infantry with bad saves if they're there, provided they're valuable enough to be worth targeting. Having just a little bit of barrage fire can be well worth it over and above the damage that they actually put out. You can use the precision fire to take down units on objectives, or small injured units that are just about to do something really important and painful to your army. Say a fighty dreadnought on its last wound that you can't hit with anything else, but you desperately need just to shave 1 wound off. So overall, I'd say that these guys seem usable, a problem for certain armies to face, but they also do cost really quite a lot of points at 35 points per model, and they do have their weaknesses. They are very easy to kill if the opponent can get range on them with the right guns, and I feel like their barrage weapons just aren't quite strong enough to justify their entire points cost just for that in the vast majority of games, so they'd have to make use of both that and the direct fire in most matchups, and on top of that, in at least a few games I feel like the opponent just isn't really going to care too much about the barrage profile. Say things like Dark Angels, Deathwing, or Custodes, where a few AP -1 shots just aren't going to cut it. They do seem like an interesting unit though. If you can make use of both profiles, then their numbers aren't too bad when you put them together. Both long-range anti-tank and ignores line-of-sight firepower are new things to the Primaris range, things they didn't really have before, at least in terms of infantry models. It is interesting enough to get those on a core profile that you could give buffs and stratagems to. In terms of competitors within the Space Marine Codex, there isn't really all that much that really threatens them to compete with the ignores line of sight stuff. Most of the Space Marine options tend to be really quite inefficient on that at the moment, particularly after that nerf to indirect firepower. In terms of the direct shooting, they are kind of outshot by las cannon devastators if you ignored the indirect stuff, and for the most part Space Marines seem to do a bit better with the various melter platforms they get at the moment. Things like Eradicators, attack bikes and land speeders are going to do a bit better at killing tanks for the points, though they need to get a lot closer. Overall, my guess would be is that these guys will see a bit of niche use in Space Marine lists. I don't think that people are going to be running out and spamming them in vast numbers. Definitely a problem for certain armies to face, particularly things with toughness 3 profiles. For that reason, I feel like maybe you might want 1 or 2 units in a list, but probably not more than that. I feel like you'd be taking a bit too much away from the raw battle line if you went heavy on them. Look forward to hearing your thoughts though. How strong do you think these Desolation Squad Marines are? And could you see yourself using a unit of these in your own army list or not? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly be hoping to make an equivalent video to this for the Brutalis Dreadnought and the Primaris Lieutenant. We'll hopefully have those out within the next day or so. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.